Ladies and gentlemen, this is the program on constitutional government, and our speaker today is John Judis. John Judis is an intellectual, let's just say intelligent journalist who takes up big questions that are relevant and interesting, and that the scaredy cat political scientists hardly ever dare to venture to. So he's written a book on populism, which is a new thing, but also an old thing. And he's going to discuss that today. Let me tell you, too, that he's a graduate of Berkeley, Amherst and Berkeley, and he got an MA in philosophy at Berkeley, so that means you're probably not voting for Trump if you've been to college.
Writing in Baumgartner.
Yeah, he's writing in Baumgartner. He's very much, yes, we know who that. It's very much a baseball fan.
Right.
Yeah, and he's editor at large for Talking Points Memo, previously senior editor of the New Republic. There's probably a story there, and a senior writer for National Journal, and he's the author of 6 other books, including Genesis, Truman and American Jews, and the Origin of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, The Paradox of American Democracy, Elites, Special Interests, and the Betrayal of Public Trust. And he's written for a number of important publications, including the New York Times Magazine, American Prospect, Washington Post. And he was born in Chicago and lives now in outside Washington, D.C. in Silver Spring. So, John Judis.
I don't get resounding applause.
Well, let's give him some applause.
Thank you for having me, and I've never spoken at this place before, and I feel very honored to be at such an august university. I was trying to figure out some of those equations outside. I thought if I could solve them, I could figure out who was going to win the election in November. But I didn't know whether they were actually gags or not, because I don't think they were, They're not? They're serious stuff? Okay. Let me talk about how I came to this subject. I met with the people who started this thing, Columbia Global Reports, which is not a university press. It's actually a trade press. And they and I were interested in a book on populism, but they had doubts whether I should even do the United States. I mean, we knew things were happening in Europe, but this was, May of 2015. The Tea Party was sort of dying out. Occupy Wall Street had fizzled. And I just sort of had an interest, at least in explaining why there wasn't such a big populist uprising in the United States. So that's May of 2015. So then, in August, my wife and I always go to New Hampshire for a week or 2 weeks. And I dragged her around to these candidate meetings, the town hall meetings. And we went to a meeting, it was called a town hall meeting of this guy, Donald Trump, and it was in Hampton. And it was at a high school. And we arrived, and it was like I don't know if this still happens, it was like going to a movie premiere for Godfather 2. It was like the line snaked all around this high school. It must have been 200 yards of people waiting to see this guy. And I really had no idea that he was going to be that popular. And they weren't people who were all birthers or whatever. They were curious. It was his celebrity. He was, he had something magic about this guy. So we heard him, and he talked about some of the things that are familiar. and have become controversial. His stand, for instance, on illegal immigration. He didn't call Mexicans rapists. It was a New Hampshire. It wasn't a loyal Trump following, and I think he was more careful than he became since then. But he also talked about things that really surprised me. He talked about Ford Motor Company moving its assembly plant to Mexico and throwing American workers out of jobs. He talked about NAFTA, and NAFTA in general as being something that had resulted in the loss of American manufacturing. He talked about our trade relations with China and how that had also cost Americans jobs. He talked about American corporations moving their headquarters to various islands in order to evade taxes. He didn't attack Medicare or Social Security or threaten to privatize them. In fact, he said he would protect them. It was a very different message in that respect from what I had expected and what you would have gotten, let's say, from Jeb Bush at the time, who was seen at that time still as the sure front runner and a likely choice. It reminded me a lot of Ross Perot in 1992. Perot lacked that hard right edge that Trump had, the nastiness. But in terms of the economic nationalism, in terms of posing a conflict between what he then called the silent majority and the establishment, the leaders of the parties in Washington, the big money people who wanted to influence other politicians. It was very much reminiscent of Perot, and it was reminiscent of the tradition of American populism. Okay, so then a month or two after that, I went to a Bernie Sanders rally. I'm the same age, minus 2 weeks as Bernie, and we both come out of the New Left. Very, very similar. I didn't become a politician. I became a writer, but, there's a lot of... He was Vermont, I was Berkeley. I never expected somebody like that to get more than like 3% in the primaries. I mean, he would be vying with Martin O'Malley and Jim Webb while Hillary Clinton raced ahead. And the same kind of thing, these huge throngs of people, a much different crowd than the Trump crowd. The Trump crowd was, well, again, slightly more male, older, lower middle class. Sanders young, college educated, 20s, 30s, but not so much a group that was expressing a kind of student idealism. Instead, they were also angry about what had happened to the economy, about the rigged economy, about student debt. There were certain resemblances in feeling between the two groups. Sanders himself still identified himself as a socialist. But his message had very little to do with pairing the working class against the capitalist class and trying to have ownership and control of the means of production. None of that. He also wasn't a typical liberal, just as Trump wasn't a business conservative. He didn't talk about reconciling the classes, bringing people together, Republicans, Democrats, all the leaders in the country, and solving problems that way. It's very characteristic of progressivism and liberalism since the early 20th century. And to think about it again, think about Bill Clinton after he came into office. He had that thing with Little Rock with all the business leaders and labor leaders. Bernie talked about the billionaire class and that they're ripping us off. We have a rigged economy and we have to do something about it. That message again resonates. It's classic American populism. So in both cases, what I was finding was a populist message. What do I mean by that? The American populism itself is not a. When I was in a philosopher earlier in my life. I was a Wittgensteinian, and you know part of the theory of language, that there is no essential characteristic of a game or a chair, and that's even more true of political terms. Liberals in Australia mean a lot different from liberals in the United States, and so on. Populism has all these different applications. It can mean I've heard Vladimir Putin described as a populist. Ronald Reagan was described as a populist. But what interested me was a particular populist tradition that begins in the 1890s in the United States with the American Populists, the People's Party, and that's where the term itself comes from. And in Germany and France, it's the same term, populist. It's the same. So what that tradition itself is framed within democracies, and the heart of it is that there's a conflict between the people and an elite or an establishment, and the populist is the tribune of the people against this elite or establishment. You can draw a distinction between, let's say, left-wing and right-wing populists, though as I'll say, that this becomes a little misleading in the terms left and right. But a populist like Sanders, everything goes upwards. He's going to unite the middle and the lower of America against the elites. Somebody like Trump or Marine Le Pen in France also sees a conflict between the people and the elite, right? I mean, Trump talks about Ford Motor Company. He talks about trade deals that are ripping off American workers. But there is also a third element, which is to say that the establishment or elites coddle another party, African Americans, George Wallace, Muslims, France, Europe, illegal immigrants. So there's another party, and that's the element to it that distinguishes the right from the left. Okay, so having said that, I go to Europe in the winter to investigate there, and I go mainly to, I just go to France, Spain, and Denmark for various reasons that I thought I could figure it out better there. And again, what I found in Europe was that there were two very different kinds of populist movements going there, all of which had this same core conflict between the people and the establishment. In Northern Europe, primarily what I've been calling right-wing populism. And Southern Europe, Greece, Italy, Spain, left-wing, Podemos, Syriza, and Greece. But now, just before I try to explain all this, I want to add another thing that I thought was very odd that I discovered, which is that what is sometimes called right-wing or far-right, and I've seen these things that call it far-right populists in Europe, and they talk about the National Front that way in France, even the Finns party in Finland, which actually sits in the center of the legislature there. So I just want to read you the platform of the National Front, some of what is in that platform. And I'm saying this again in terms of thinking of these groups as left and right. They call for a strategic plan for reindustrialization, tariffs and quotas to protect against unfair competition, the separation of commercial from investment banking, in other words, Glass-Steagall, this is the Bernie demand, a transaction tax on stock purchases, the Tobin tax, again, something you'll find on the left wing of the left wing in the Democratic Party. Opposition to cuts in social spending, a cap on credit card charges. Opposition to privatization, equal health care access regardless of income or location, and rejection of the European Union's attempt to impose austerity. So, in other words, it becomes difficult to call these parties by the conventional left and right or liberal and conservative. They do fit in this very strange tradition of populism that the United States, it comes to Europe in the 1970s or so and really begins to flourish in the 1990s. And now the populist parties, let's say Switzerland, France, all the Scandinavian countries, again, the more right-wing, they're all either on the edge of power or sharing in power. Greece, Syriza is the government. Spain, Podemos is the third, but I think after this breakup of the Socialist Party there, they might end up as the second party in Spain. So these parties have been enormously successful in the last 20 years. And the question I pose to myself is why? Why this should be happening now and what this represents. And that's basically what the book is about. Okay, that's the introduction. That's the preface. Now I'll talk a little about what my answer is, and then you can tell me that I'm wrong. The question I pose really is whether there is something that binds together both sides of the Atlantic. Whether you can understand Trump-Sanders on the one hand and National Front and Podemos, the Spanish group, as sort of paired, whether they come out of a similar kind of framework, and why both these are happening now. And I think a lot of it has to do with a challenge to prevailing worldviews. This is a concept that I get from various sources, a little Gramsci, William Appleman Williams, Genovese, the way he described the world of the slaveholders, and he was very influenced by Gramsci. The idea that within particular eras, people have a common assumption about the relation between government and the economy. And government and society, you can broaden it too. Gramsci talked about common sense. I'm describing a broader thing, a worldview. And not everybody agrees with every detail of it, but then it's still prevailing. Here's how it would work. After World War II, both Europe and the United States enjoy, 3 decades of prosperity. During that time in the United States, whether Republicans or Democrats were in charge, the underlying worldview was one that comes out of the 30s, New Deal liberalism, with something about the Cold War thrown in. But again, it's the idea that the state has a responsibility for the welfare of the people, and that prosperity itself is based upon the idea that as people get higher wages and benefits from the state, those go into buying products, those go into higher profits. The profits can be used to increase wages, benefits. So there's a kind of virtuous circle going there, which is based upon demand. In the early 70s, the boom ends. It doesn't necessarily end dramatically, but I could even feel it in the United States. If you had been in your 20s and 30s in the United States at the time when we were going to college in the 60s, none of us are worried about jobs. I mean, really, it just seems so odd. Or even, you're sort of worried about careers, but you're worried about the meaning of life. Whether I could do something. Early 70s, everything starts to change. There's different explanations for it. One is excess capacity around the world and increased global competition in things like steel and shipbuilding and textiles, so that businesses suddenly find their profits threatened. They can't raise prices as easily. While at the same time, both in Western Europe and the United States, there's pressure from below, from unions that have become very powerful over the prior 30 years and are able to win wage agreements. So Beginning in the 1970s, corporations feel very squeezed. And what they develop in concert with economists and policymakers in Washington, and with initially Republicans, though Democrats come over to this. Thatcher in Great Britain is a key figure. It is, again, if you call the one demand side, I'd call the second supply side. And it's the idea that something has to be done to protect and expand profits. And in order to do that, you have to reduce costs. And there's two key things that are involved in this. The first is capital mobility. The idea that corporations should be able to move wherever they want in the world in order to reduce their costs. Offshoring, outsourcing, whatever. Which before that, again, is a very touchy proposition. Equally, banks, money can flow wherever it wants in the world. Deregulation of finance, which again, before that, in the 30 years after World War II, there are capital controls. And a lot of the trade treaties are devoted to that rather than to getting tariffs removed on goods. NAFTA, for instance, I'm exaggerating because I don't remember, but there used to actually be a percentage. There was like 40 pages on tariffs and 400 pages on protecting investments against nationalization and things like that, and allowing insurance and finance into Mexico. So that becomes central, the idea of capital mobility. The other thing is labor mobility, because if you have a surplus, if you have what Marx used to call the reserve army of the proletariat, that puts a lot of pressure on wages. It also puts a lot of pressure on unions. United States, you get two major immigration bills, 1965 and then 1990. And as a result of those, there is an influx of semi-skilled and unskilled labor that over 20, 30 years transforms a lot of industries that were sort of mid-wage, many unionized, like meat packing, into lower wage industries, and also creates, as we'll see, a lot of resentments. Europe, you have the guest worker programs that after World War II that were intended to address the labor shortages. But after the 70s, that's no longer a problem. The guest workers stay, and they multiply. Asylum workers come, and then you have Schengen, the Schengen Agreement in the late 1980s, which comes to apply to all the countries in the EU, which is open borders. So somebody from Eastern Europe can go to Great Britain or to France or wherever and work there and compete with workers who are already there, and make it more difficult for wage increases to occur. So in both those respects, capital mobility and labor mobility, you have measures that were intended to reduce costs or to prevent costs from going up, and to protect and expand profits. Now, you could call this thing neoliberalism. In the United States, I call it sort of market liberalism. It's embraced eventually by both parties. Under Clinton, you get NAFTA, you get the deregulation of finance. Blair in Great Britain, Mitterrand in France is finally forced to embrace a certain kind of austerity. And the promise of this neoliberalism was that it would produce prosperity. That as profits went up, they would come back into higher wages, and you get the same kind of virtuous cycle. So, to some extent, in the United States, that happens in the late 80s. But then we have a recession in 1991. And it's a very strange recession. It's not that deep, but it has a long half-life. It lasts through in terms of wage stagnation and things like that to I'd say spring of 1996. So that's the era when you see Perot and Buchanan in the United States. Then you get a boom, the internet boom. And even though during that period you have tremendous inequality and you have all these internet billionaires, nobody cares about it. They're actually heroes, on the contrary. I mean, you get none of the feeling you have now, or, in the last 4 or 5 years about billionaires and the Hamptons or whatever, because there's tremendous optimism about the economy. The promise seems to have been kept. Then the war on terror, to a great extent, Americans are preoccupied with that. There might have been something might have happened in the early 2000s if not for that. But 2008, you get the recession, the Great Recession. And we're still living through the end of that. And in the course of that, you get the Tea Party, you get Occupy Wall Street, which, flickered and died after a few months, but had spread to like 75 cities in America in the course of that. I mean, it was a big deal, and also, as a matter of fact, influenced a lot of the Europeans. And then you get the Trump and Sanders campaign. Again, Trump, you can say, well, the guy is a racist and a bigot and a nativist, et cetera, the way he addresses illegal immigration. But there's an underlying issue there that's bringing it to the surface, and that's making people in, let's say, these towns in Iowa that used to be centers of meatpacking say, I'm going to vote for Trump. And it's not necessarily, you can't reduce that to their being racist or bigots or nativists. Ohio as well, again. So it's a lot of this that we're seeing now is in response to the failure of neoliberalism to produce the kind of prosperity that it seemed to promise. Europe, obviously, the same thing. It just becomes a little more complicated because you have the European Union. And the European Union, in effect, becomes a kind of neoliberal structure that enforces austerity. Countries can't devalue when they get in trouble. What they have to do, basically, and this is what happens in Greece and Spain, is cut the consumption of their workers so that they can improve their trade balance. And that produces a lot of unhappiness. You get in Europe this strange kind of separation between the North and the South. The South is sort of like Depression America. The unemployment is so bad that the middle and the lower parts of the society are thrown together. In Spain, when I used to do the emerging democratic majority with Rui Teixeira, I used to joke that he did the math and I did the English, so I would always ask him, now what exactly is the number? So I'm going to give you my own BS number, but unemployment among 18 to 34-year-olds in Spain still is above 40%. I don't know the exact number. But these are Greece. These are like depression-level circumstances, and they're very similar to the kind of circumstances that Roosevelt faced in the early 1930s, as a result of which you had a tremendous populist upsurge on the left. Huey Long, parts of the Roosevelt coalition itself, but much less on the right, much more muted. Northern Europe, you have still relative prosperity. I think at the height of the recession in Denmark, unemployment was about 7%, and now it's below 5%. So you get a different kind of reaction. You get something, and again, this fits part of the United States too, where the middle feels squeezed, the middle of society, but they don't feel solidarity with the lower parts. Instead, what they're worried about is that the upper part is going to give too many subsidies to the lower part that they're going to have to pay for in taxes, or in the case of Obamacare, in higher premiums or whatever. So you get in those kind of societies where the Great Recession was not devastating, a right wing. The United States fits both. It has both profiles, so we have a left wing and a right wing reaction. But in the beginning, it was primarily the Tea Party. It was primarily on the right. Now, let me see what else I should talk about before I throw it open to questions. Let me finish by talking a little bit about, should I talk about this thing about the difference between them and fascism? Because I always get this question when okay, and then I'll do the wind-up. One of the questions that often arises about these movements aren't they fascist? Isn't it the beginning again? Isn't Trump Hitler? And aren't we seeing in Europe the beginnings of the something very similar to the 1920s? And look, I would compare it to the revolutionaries of the 19th century who, every time there was an upsurge, they thought the French Revolution was recapitulating itself. Very similar to us. Every time something bad happens, we think it's the Nazis and the fascists. And I think that that's a mistaken way to understand it. The two things that distinguish our circumstances, and I'm not saying that there aren't features in common and certain similarities, scapegoating, things like that, but the two historical features that distinguish our period from that period, from the 1920s, from Italy and Germany, are first that the 1920s, it was primarily in the context of the Russian Revolution and the threat of communists and socialists creating a revolution. That's what led to sympathy from business to eventually to Mussolini and also to Hitler. It also meant that those movements were not saw democracy to the extent that they did elections merely as a means to an end. The democratic context itself was very much in question. That's not the case, I think, now in Western Europe and the United States. In the right-wing populist parties in Europe have gone in power and out of power. They've changed their leaders. It's a much different it's a circumstance. There are little similarities between Eastern Europe. Again, I don't know a lot about Eastern Europe. I didn't study it as carefully, but in Eastern Europe there still is the legacy of Soviet communism. So there is more of an authoritarian edge there than there is in the United States and what you find in Europe, and somewhat Greece too, where you have the Golden Dawn. But again, context, political context is different. The second thing is that both the Nazis and the fascists in Italy saw themselves as creating a new empire. For Mussolini, it would be the Roman Empire revived. For Hitler, it was the Third Reich. And they were basically expansionist in that sense. They saw imperial conquest as the heart of what they were after. The populist movements today on the right or the left, and I don't know whether this is a real word, are contractionary. They're centripetal rather than centrifugal. Trump doesn't want to take over Mexico. He wants to keep Mexicans out of the United States. The Europeans don't want a bigger EU. They don't want to expand, to take over more countries. They want to contract. They want less EU. They want to leave the European Union altogether. It's more a narrow nationalism than the kind of imperial expansionism. And that's very different. That's fundamentally different from the older fascism. So, again, I think that that's not and it doesn't mean these movements are good, again, but they're novel. They're not something you can simply see through the prism of the old and understand. Last thing, let me just talk about the future a little. The nature of populists populism is that populist movements, candidates, parties tend to put forth demands that the establishment and elite are not willing to grant. They're not demands that are crazy. Like Bernie Sanders could say, well, I'm for Medicare and all, and free college education, and that's, that's Europe, Canada. It's not inconceivable that we could have those in this country, but it's pretty inconceivable that you could get those through Congress in the next 4 years or 8 years, or that the leaders of the insurance companies and stuff like that would live with them. Similarly with Trump, he says he's going to put a 35% tariff on Ford Motor Company's goods that they ship back from their assembly plant. Now, I never heard of those kind of selective tariffs. I don't think that would quite work. I don't think he could. I mean, it's a goofy idea, but it gets again at a real problem. We've got to do something about this. So populists, in that sense, are not governing part. They're not proto-government parties. They're not parties that can easily slide from where they are into government. And sometimes when they do, like Syriza in Greece, they find themselves completely compromised and screwed, and they can't do anything that they promised to do, and they end up like the old parties they wanted to replace, and they're going to get thrown out of office, I predict, the next election, because they've had to embrace exactly the austerity that they promised they would combat. So you can't look at these populist candidates and movements and say, well, are their plans realistic now? Will the Congressional Budget Office endorse them? What you can see in them is that they're an early warning sign of trouble with this consensus, with this prevailing worldview. They're a sign that in the future something's going to happen. It can't go on forever. The populists in the 1890s, William Jennings Bryan, early warning sign that this whole laissez-faire era was not working. What's going to happen in the next few years? I think Europe is in a much more perilous situation than the United States because of the straitjacket of the EU. And Brexit may be the beginning of disillusion. I can't tell. But I think the United States can keep going again for 4, 8, 12 years based upon this kind of weird economic system that we have where we run big trade deficits, but then the Japanese and the Chinese and now the Germans as well buy our bonds and keep us afloat so we don't become insolvent. When that cycle starts to fray, as it did during the beginning of the Great Recession where you had bubbles, and then we could be in trouble. But in the near future, I don't expect that. What I would expect is continual gridlock, the kind of thing we've had for the last, you could say even 20 years, between Republicans, Democrats, Congress, the presidency. We await another crisis in that sense. But the populist movements and Sanders and Trump, I think, again, are warnings that turmoil is on the way and that there will come a time when the establishment, the elite, are going to have to think their way through how they are going to accommodate a very unhappy public. So that's, now I welcome your questions. Or do you want me to just keep standing here?
No, you don't have to. Why don't you come sit down?
Okay, we'll be more informal now.
Okay. First get settled.
Now, who do I think will win between the Giants and the Cubs?
That's your problem.
Yeah, really.
Professor Scary.
Yes. Hi. I appreciated and enjoyed your presentation, and parts of it would agree with, lots of it. But what I'm puzzled by or struck by is how narrowly economistic your analysis is.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned what started happening in 1973 economically. Well, of course, that was also the year of Roe v. Wade, which was just the beginning of a whole series, as you know, of, in that instance, I would argue, of challenges to middle-class values from the left. But obviously, even if you don't accept that characterization, was the beginning of a whole series of cultural change that doesn't necessarily conflict with an economic analysis such as you presented, but is certainly, in many instances, I would be inclined to argue, has a life of its own, but at the same time reflects the emergence of these economic elites who don't seem to have much investment in any communities that make any sense to ordinary people, elites that express great disdain for the lives of ordinary people in various ways. And I'm using elites here a little too loosely because I think that might be true of many of the business elites, but at the same time, I think it's also true of many on the left who aren't part of the business elites, but who have a cultural agenda that they've been pressing. So I wonder how you see those cultural changes figuring into the story or not.
Good question. Can you hear me? Is this okay? It's a little high for a short guy like me, right? Should we put this down a little? Okay. Looks good now, right? Okay. When you cover politics for 40 or 45 years, there's not a lot of things you haven't thought about. And that's what I thought about. I'm basically still a Marxist on this stuff, but I'll give you I'll give you my answer, which is that these cultural conflicts are important, but that when the crisis hits, they become subordinate. Prohibition, immense Ku Klux Klan, 1920s. The big change is not, the big battle in the early 30s is not over them. They get pushed to the side. If you look at the, there's a book that I like now. I was looking up, it's my favorite book of the called The Radical Center, Middle Americans and the Politics of Alienation by Donald Warren. And he was a lowly associate professor at Oakland University. And he wrote this book, he published it in 1976. And I consider it one of the 2 or 3 best books about American politics of the last 50 years. Warren did these studies in 1971 and surveys, extensive surveys of the electorate. And what he found was what he called a radical middle, the middle American radicals. At the time, they were primarily lower middle or middle class. They were high school graduates, but no higher. But again, this is the early 70s. Now they would be trade school, junior college, and some a modest college, but not a fancy college like this. Older, more male than female. Primarily white, you're getting the picture, right? And feeling aggrieved, both embattled by the elites in Washington that ignore them and ignore their issues, and by the people below them who they think are being favored by the elites. It's, in other words, it's just the model I tried to give of right-wing populism, but also still New Deal liberals, like as George Wallace was, not against Medicare or Social Security, wanting to tax the rich. Now, this group of people, in my opinion, move through the society and the economy like a sort of like a when it, these things about when a python swallows a big animal, a porcupine or something, and you see it going through its pipe. It remains, but their demands tend to change. Christian conservative at one time, Grover Norquist once explained to me, I mean, his view was that it's the same people, but the issues are fungible. They change at different times. Guns, terror, Muslims coming into the country to kill us all. When I used to go to Christian Coalition meetings, I used to cover them. I wasn't a member. I would find, for instance, this was, I think this was in 1992 when Buchanan was running for president, that the leadership, who were basically Republican operatives, Reed and Robertson, wanted NAFTA because that was what, they were business Republicans. Then if you talk to the rank and file, they were like Buchananites. They were all, so the issue was there. In other words, there was this economic as well as the cultural dimension. What's happened in the in the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years is that the economic issues have come to the fore and they're more important now. Trump his thing on abortion is just nominal, and it's not. In fact, he was pro-choice before. It's not a big issue. Again, that would be the way I would see it. I would see that yes, cultural stuff was very important, and also integrated with the economic. But at the moment of crisis, the economic stuff becomes more important. So, but it's a good question. It's a hard to piece things out.
In particular, what about immigration on this?
Well, immigration is the same thing.
They're not just pushing down wages; they're also rapists.
Absolutely. There's a big cultural dimension, but again, there's an underlying economic problem that's being addressed. But that would be a good example of where they're integrated, where it's hard to separate out the one from the other.
If you just to respond quickly, I mean, it seems to me that's one of the problems with culture. It's so ubiquitous. It's like where do you want to look? But it seems to me if you're talking about Trump, the cultural change that's relevant is the discourse, and
Is the what?
Is the discourse, is the cheapening and coarsening of our discourse. That's part of our cultural change too.
Right.
I'd also pin that on the left, by the way, but we could have that discussion some other time. But in any event, the level of our debate is now so crude that too is a reflection of what we've gone through and what we're in the middle of. Now, I don't know I'm not arguing that's causing a disaffection with Trump, with our elites, but it's certainly one huge impact. And one huge change in our political and civic life that has facilitated the career of somebody like Trump.
I think that it arises partly from a feeling of people being shut out and not listened to, and it's the PC stuff.
Yeah.
And Trump's coarseness. To them, it seems like he's breaking through the barriers. I mean, that's if you were blaming the left, that would be the relevant, maybe you have some other beef with him, but that's I think that would be that's certainly a factor.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Alexandra. Thank you for coming. I really enjoyed your speech. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that populism doesn't really easily jive, I guess you can say, with the establishment. And yet it seems to me that throughout U.S. history we've had populists. The most notable one Thomas Jefferson. Many people argue he'd be a populist, and yet, I don't really see, or I guess maybe, do you think that it's ever possible that populism can incorporate itself into the establishment, or that it has ever happened in the past?
Well, look, I mean, again, we're getting into a terminological problem. Populist candidates, movements, parties define themselves against the establishment. So when they incorporate themselves as, let's say, Syriza does in Greece, then they cease to be populist. In Spain right now, they're having a big debate within Podemos. Podemos is the political party that was started by political scientists in Spain, what was it, like in 2011, 2012, after the Socialist Party there, in their eyes, sold out the country by making an agreement with the European Union to impose austerity on the country. And they very much define themselves as, I'm not good on Spanish, the La Gente versus La Casta. The Casta was the establishment, the caste. And that's how they defined their politics. A lot of them, I mean, Pablo Iglesias, the leader, was actually from the Communist Party, but they changed their outlook, their politics. They were very influenced by these philosophers, Laclau and Mouffe. I'm in Harvard, so I get into this fancy stuff, right? And so they define themselves as populists, but now they're starting to be on the edge of power, and there's a big debate within the party leadership itself whether they should still define themselves as populists. So that's what happens. It's not it's not an arbitrary definition of life, but that's how they actually think.
Rory.
I'm Rory Schachter, student in this department.
What department?
The Great Green Government Department.
The Green Government?
Great Green Government Department.
Oh, what's that?
No, borrowed from Kipling.
Oh, okay.
That one.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yes. So, I was thinking about the language you use. You emphasize the economic explanation, but then there was push back and say there's a cultural dimension. I mean, for me, the cultural versus economic is not that serious. I don't think it's a real distinction. I mean, I don't think people having humongous credit card debts they ran up I think it's both cultural and economic. So I guess the part I found unsatisfying about the presentation is the implication is neoliberalism is something which came about, which was part of or drove happy times, and then times became less happy. And populism is a pejorative term in the United States today. I know there were parties who proclaimed them that, but I know Bernie Sanders supporters and some Trump supporters, neither of them call themselves populists. That's a kind of gentle term that people use when they either don't want to use the word, say, deplorable, or where they want to say, well, not all these people are deplorable. Some of them are just having a rough time of it. And the problem, I think, with that approach, what I'm interested to have you respond to is that you kept speaking of the elites. It's a kind of generic Marxist term, the elites, or maybe it's not Marxist, but it works that I don't know who these elites are, and it exempts from specific critical analysis of the government. It just sort of lumps together the Washington establishment, the establishment.
Okay.
And so what about the fact that the government, not neoliberalism, but the government, which was run by both parties, failed? And that's a big part of what's going on here, not just neoliberalism was good for a while but didn't last.
Okay, so let me deal with both those. In Europe, populism is primarily a negative term. There was I cite this in my book, that I think they were Christian Democrats, but they might even be in the Social Democratic Foundation, did a study of different populist parties in Europe, and it was a very academic, a very useful study. It had a lot of charts and stuff, but the title was Exposing the Demagogues. And you would never from a think tank. So the philosophers I mentioned, Laclau and Mouffe, within left-wing circles now, it's begun to be a term like it is. Now this is the second thing, like it is in the United States. It's always been two-sided in the United States. You might think of it as negative, but there's a group called National People's Action in Chicago. If you ask them what their politics is, they would say populist. A lot of the groups that are forming in America, what's the Working Families Party in New York? Populist. That's how they define it, and they're not unhappy about it. But in Europe, it's entirely the way you would describe it. And I think Marine Le Pen, when they say they won't accept that term, his description. I think she said it's better populist than fascist or something. Isn't that there was a quote like that where she said, well, I'd rather be called a populist than X.
She calls herself a Republican now.
Yeah, right. But, so second part, the other thing I'd say about populism is it's not a specific ideology, it's a logic, or what the philosophy of language you'd call it a grammar. So that what constitutes the people and what constitutes the elite can change completely. What's included in them. The Tea Party began in the United States with the liberal Democrats. Now, they include the Republicans. It's Mitch McConnell, et cetera, et cetera. It's no longer just the one party. Huey Long, even though the group Share the Wealth Clubs had a lot of barbers and people who were like sort of small proprietors organizing the poor. Other groups in the United States, we usually talk about the middle class, and the middle class includes everybody. So the definition itself changes. It's more the logic of a conflict, that there's something called the people that they're trying to unite, the party or the politician, against the elites or establishment group. What exactly they are, depends on the circumstance.
But don't the established parties attack each other for being elites?
Yeah, of course.
We live in a democracy and nobody stands up and says, I'm the elite.
Yeah, no, that's right.
So then it isn't so much elite, but which elite?
Yes. Well, Ronald Reagan, when he ran for governor in 1966, attacked us student radicals as elitist. That was a lot of his.
Yeah.
We got somebody over there. Right? You choose the people.
Yeah, let's do Tom.
Hello.
Purple sweater, Tom.
You have to ask me something easy. The last questions have been too hard.
So I wanted to try to get at this cultural versus economic explanation in a different way. And so your explanation, I think, makes a lot of sense, is that people used to have, the simplest version is people used to have factory jobs and they had economic security, and then those jobs left and they lost that economic security, and the elites aren't working for them to regain it. Now, even if you admit something like that analysis, you could say, what is it they're actually after? What's the good part of having a factory job that lasts your entire life and you can be secure about it? Now, part of it is, yes, you have economic security, but also I think it's that you have some kind of purpose. You have some kind of, you have a part in your community and you have an understanding of yourself as being part of that community. So if we were to suppose, as some people have proposed, right, that you could give everyone a fixed salary, everyone in the country a fixed salary of, I don't know how much you would give them, like $20,000 or $30,000.
Guaranteed annual income. Yeah.
Here's what I'm proposing. If you did that, and that's like unlikely to happen, even if you did do that, you would still get populist movements because people would live without any purpose, any sense of their place in the community, and people would rebel against such a meaningless existence of just living on a guaranteed income with no meaning to their lives. So
you don't have to, if you get a rebellion, it doesn't have to be necessarily populist. It's not.
Oh, sure. But what I'm supposing is that part of what's involved, at least part of what's involved even in the economic analysis, is some kind of cultural factor.
Yes, I agree with you. I agree with it. And part of what let me just go off on a tangent. I think what people expected when I was growing up, and from the 40s again through the early 70s, there wasn't the idea that you did in the early part of the century, 20th century, people did imagine that the whole country was going to become one huge factory. This was Herbert Crowley thought that it wasn't just socialists, and that, you know, and then there would be the bourgeoisie at the top that would run the bankers and things like that. When I was growing up, it was more off. You'd work for a corporation. It would be either an office or it'd be a factory, and they would be large scale, and those groups would provide security and benefits. Right, and you'd live in communities that where a lot of your co-workers lived. You know, and that's just breaking down completely in this country. I mean, they talk about the gig economy, the Schedule Cs, the self-employed, the end of the unions. During the 50s, 1/3 unionized outside of farms. So unions are an important part of it. So I'm not just disagreeing with you about that. I think a lot of my explanation for the Bernie vote and for his immense popularity, and again, you're going to bring in all kinds of cultural factors too, but I think that there's an economic anxiety that these kids feel, and it's not just about student debt. It's also about where are they going to be and what kind of jobs, what's going to be. Things seem to be shifting too quickly. They taught, what was it, the Tofflers did Future Shock in '69, it was about that, but now even more so. My own industry is a total mess. I mean, things just go in and out, and I'm glad I'm at a phase of retirement, because I would hate to be 25 or 30 years old and trying to figure out what I was going to do. Because you really could see, 30 or 40 years ago, if you were 25, you could see what you were going to do when you were 55. It was not, I mean, you might be wrong about it, but you could still see. So yes, there's a basic insecurity. It has to do with living in communities, where you work, all that stuff.
Yeah, and it just seems to me that even if the things Bernie and Trump were proposing were carried out, and we had tariffs, or we found a way to create more jobs, I don't think it seems obvious to me we can't recreate what existed from the 50s onward.
No, I don't.
And I don't think it would solve the real problem.
Leave Bernie out of that, because I think that he's right. I think that the basic problem that we have in this country is that we aren't going to have this structure where we have these large institutions that provide security for people. And so the government has to do it. And in that sense, I think that the Medicare for All and the free education are very important, because they provide this certain basic kind of freedom from insecurity. There's still going to be tremendous messing around and change and going from one job to another. But I think Americans, it's hard to, when I go to Europe, I see a real contrast there. I think Americans feel a basic kind of insecurity that many Europeans do not feel. And that if you had that kind of social democracy, it would be a tremendous improvement. Trump's stuff is that's a different story.
Andy.
I'd like to ask a question about celebrity/personality. That's one piece of it. The relationship between that and ideology, and then the question of party rules, and the relationship between what transpired with the Democrats, between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, and what happened between the rest of the sort of regular Republican figures and Donald Trump. But most especially your view of what role celebrity and personality played in Donald Trump's ability to do what he did with the rest of the Republican field, not having ever really...
So that's the main question.
That's the main question.
Okay. Fine, I can answer that. I don't know whether satisfactorily, but Trump was a celebrity well before this year. Again, somebody asked me, well, is it all people who were going to see him in New Hampshire because they liked his thing about, Obama being a Kenyan? Most 99% of the people had never heard that. I mean, when Trump in 1988 was when Roger Stone, who was his advisor at the time, had taken over from Roy Cohn, the job of being his kind of consigliere. I don't know whether it was just for promotion or not, but he convinced him to go to New Hampshire to give a speech that would sort of be, I think it must have been late 1987, that would be a hint that he might run for president. And he got a bigger crowd then in 1987 than any of the other candidates. And of course he said he wasn't running, but it was the same. So he's been a celebrity since like the early 80s. He was on the cover of People magazine. So that is a factor. The other factor is that his speeches, I found, are arresting. He actually knows how to talk. He can talk to an audience, and you feel like he's having a conversation with you, even though all his speeches are basically the same. It's like one of those French novels where you change, shuffle the deck and you get a different novel, but it's the same thing. It's he tells the same stories. He usually puts in some provocation that'll get on the TV news, but it's always the same thing. But you feel as if he's conversing with you. It's like it's like one of these Jack Parr or somebody. It's.
There's a name.
Yeah, I know. I know. I don't watch TV. I just watch sports on TV, so I can never remember the name. It's not Stephen Colbert because these people are much more mannered, but it's the kind of conversational. It's a conversational style of talking that's extremely successful. So those are the. I mean, that I think was important to his success. So.
Do you think if it had been Chris Christie as an example of another person with a certain style and town hall meetings and all that he could have done what Trump did? I mean, he did run. Or do you think it required Trump being already the mega wattage of his celebrity being? I mean, I sort of missed the whole hit television program, The Apprentice.
Yeah, me too.
So,
that's why
I still
surprised.
remember Trump is the guy who bankrupted Atlantic City.
Yeah.
So that's where my question is going. Is it how much of it was just the fact that he was so well known?
I think that was a big factor. I mean, if you want to get into the nuts and bolts of the primary, I think the Christie was a key person, but his key role was in killing off Rubio in New Hampshire, and I think Rubio could have I think he might have beaten Trump, but he was the only one. Again, I think that. I think too with Trump, I think the immigration thing was very important. I think that's brought out a lot of the Tea Party people. Again, think about this fungible group that changes its conviction, and 20 years ago was worried about school prayer. Immigration rang a lot of bells. That was a lot of what when I would talk to people at the rallies, that's what they would bring up. But if you talk to them also about Medicare and Social Security and things like that, they would say what Trump said too. We like Medicare and Social Security. What we don't like is Obamacare, because that's just for those people that we earned these are benefits we earned. So anyway,
Susan.
Hi. Yeah. So I wanted to return to this culture versus economics distinction. My apologies if you wanted to move on. But looking at the Brexit vote, which I think can be understood in this wider trend of rebellion against elites, it seems to me that the economic consensus was that a positive Brexit vote would be horrible for the British economy. Everybody seemed to be agreeing on that, everybody seemed to be saying that. But we see that the Brexit vote is a yes. People do want to leave. Right. And to what extent do you think it's that the people who supported the measure ignored the economic forecast because they were conducted by this elite class versus they said, fine, we understand that it may be bad for us economically, but our narrow nationalism, the xenophobia is such that we're willing to take that hit?
I'm happy to answer that, but I'm not I don't claim to know a lot about. I wrote about it in the book, but I know more about some of the other countries than I do about Britain. So take what I say and figure it out yourself. UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, comes pretty much out of the Tories. Its an original base is petty bourgeois. Can I use that word? Small shopkeeper, things like people who have a nostalgia about England and are worried about losing their sovereignty, the country losing its sovereignty to the European Union. It's nothing economic about it in that sense. But in 2004, Blair has the option of whether Britain should comply with the Schengen agreements to open its borders. And he could wait 7 years, but he doesn't wait 7 years. He opens it then. Tremendous influx of Eastern Europeans into the country. We're not talking about I think it's primarily the Eastern Europeans who come into a lot of these working class communities in the eastern part, northeastern, southeastern, and there is an economic factor. It may be that in the United States actually I think immigrants to a great extent in the early part do take over jobs in construction and hotels and restaurants and meat packing. There may not have been direct competition. There may more have been that these are communities that have been devastated during the Thatcher years and afterwards as manufacturing left. But there was a feeling that that the immigration was bringing wages down. It wasn't just a feeling of cultural difference. And so the UKIP itself, and this happens in France too, which began as a petty bourgeois party, ends up as a working class party and gets all this new support, based again partly on economics, and that's a lot of why it succeeds. I think that you have with the experts there the same kind of thing we were talking about with Trump and political correctness. I think that they believed that the experts were just full of bullshit, that they just didn't believe them, and that they were just speaking in behalf of their own interests and the banks and things like that. And that alienation existed beforehand and was the basis for that feeling. So even though there was all those predictions of doom, I don't think they took them seriously. I thought they would actually be better off. So I think, incidentally, that a lot of the reaction to Trump is bullshit. A lot of this Peterson group, this Peterson International, I'm going to go up on a tirade now, the Institute for International Economics. So this is the group that in 1992 assured us that NAFTA would bring 170,000 new jobs in 3 years and a surplus, and you know what happens. In 2000, they published a study of the China and the WTO, and they say we're going to have a surplus with them. We're going to have more exports to them than they'll have imports to the United States. It's going to be, a great deal. And of course, nothing like that happens. So now they published this study that if Trump is elected, there's going to be 4.3 million people will lose their jobs by 1919 and will be deep in a depression. Now, if you look at what they did, they took the 35% tariff that Trump said that he's going to put on Ford and applied it to all of Mexico, so that he was going to put a tariff. So even the math was goofy, but the main thing that I don't like is these are people who are experts, and they should be taking the problem itself seriously, and instead it's a very partisan kind of report that just takes him at his worst and says doom's going to exist. They don't think about, well, what about our relations with China and jobs and stuff like that? They just say, it's all bullshit. So in a way, we're having the same thing here. And I think when a worker in Ohio sees that study from the Peterson, they'll say, oh, forget it. These people, Anyway, that's my tirade about them.
Very good. Susan Wang is president of the Harvard Democrats.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
She's not the...
she's an important establishment figure.
As long as she's not with the Peterson Institute for International Economics, I'm okay.
Yes, you and then Art.
My question has to do with the reaction of elites to populist outrage, populist politics, populist movements. It seems to me that the reaction amongst American elites has been imprudent, to say the least. You could take Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables comment. You could take, the fact that here we have Donald Trump standing for a reaction against political correctness and being criticized on national media on a 24/7 news cycle for the outrageous things that he says, which is exactly what he's talking about, right? I mean, so that feeds into his kind of his case. And it seems to me that if you are looking at this from a class conflict perspective, I'm not going to say Marxist, but let's just say class conflict perspective, and you're an elite, it seems to me that the prudent question to ask is, how do we take the edge off of the moral indignation of the working class, and especially the white working class? And it seems to me that the exact opposite has taken place. So I'm curious, A, what is your kind of analysis, diagnosis of how elites have been reacting to populism in America over the past couple of years? And maybe also if you have a comparative perspective of how European elites have been reacting to it.
Same. I said that, exposing the demagogues. And, and putting like the Finnish party, which is a center party, along with far rights, and the same thing is happening here. I think the reaction has been deplorable. I mean, if Trump wasn't such a goofball, I just again, my concern has never been people being unfavorable toward Trump. It's his supporters and what they're about. And the main thing that I hear when I talk about it with liberals is that they're all racist. And I think that's also, if you find these social scientists, they do these kind of studies based on the General Social Survey, and they have this damn test about implicit racism. I'll tell you a story that in 2008, during the Obama-Clinton primary, I undertook my own study of American race relations based on all these things. I taught myself the statistics so I could figure out all these things, and I took I used the implicit racism thing. There's some social scientists from the University of Washington who are always proving this. They did it with the Tea Party, and so. But I proved that I'm exaggerating only a little, that Obama couldn't possibly be elected president based on these things. Again, I'm among academics, so they ask all these questions that are supposed to indicate implicit racism. The other thing I found that was interesting to me was that I scored very poorly on these tests. Do you know how you do them? They show you these kind of Rorschach things, and then you press a button, 1 or 2. And again, I have a good explanation for that, which is that I was brought up in Chicago during the 40s. And when I was young, my parents were very well off. And I was brought up with this fantasy that the blacks from the South Side were going to come and kill us all. I'm serious. And and don't laugh, because a lot of you have this kind of thing in different forms. And it's part of my unconscious. It shows up in dreams. If I have somebody banging on the door to kill me at night, a lot of times it's a black person in the dream. But I don't, it's not determinative of my political attitudes and choices. I can still be part of the civil rights movement. I can still, again, vote for Obama. And that's true of Americans, period. They're more complicated. But for the liberals and for these social scientists, who I think just have an axe to grind, a political axe to grind, I think it's very partisan. It's a matter, they're just racist, so let's dismiss all these people. And if you have that attitude, you are going to create polarization in the society. You're never going to get to the bottom of a lot of our problems. So, yeah, I'm entirely agreeing with you.
My question is along the same lines as the previous one about what you think will be likely or productive elite reactions, but coming at it from a different angle. You've cited the Peterson Institute expert dismissal and the basket of deplorables, shock and horror dismissal. But there's another elite reaction, which we've seen in France, which is for a mainstream center-right party to shift to the far right and go after the vote by becoming even more xenophobic, even more rhetorically protectionist than the far-right parties. So Sarkozy in France, for example, has called for repudiating the Schengen Agreement. He says he'll have a Frexit referendum if he's elected. He wants to jail people who are merely suspected of affiliation with radical Islam without any overt evidence, and similar reactions of that sort. So do you think that that's a productive reaction for a mainstream party to take, and do you see that as a likely reaction? If
By productive.
productive in terms of votes, is it likely to be a winning strategy? And do you think that that will be the reaction in the United States if Trump loses? Will the Republicans try to emulate Trump's appeal to that segment of the electorate?
Okay, that's a good question. Theresa May, too, with the, a lot of what she's done is wonderful rhetorically. I don't know, but again, I don't know the real particulars of what's happening in her cabinet and all that, but her actual statements. But on the other hand, she's incorporated this stuff about every company has to give a list of all its foreign workers. That starts to border on the...
Right, and she's now called upon the LSE and other universities to list all of their foreign academics.
Yes, well, that's exactly that. But that's exactly what you're saying in Sarkozy. I don't know how that will play out in Europe. I know in the United States it's hard to get away with that because we have such a huge minority population that simply doesn't exist comparably in Europe. Maybe in France, but even there it's really different. So I don't, I think that there's going to be at some point a more restrictive immigration policy, a kind of policy like Canada has, will come into favor without a nativist edge to it. Without an edge where we're keeping out rapists and criminals, but that in terms of our economy, it's better not to create all these surpluses that end up screwing African Americans and recent Hispanic immigrants. So, but as far as the real, the sort of, we took a Tom Tancredo kind of, or Steve King from Iowa, I don't think that that's going to be. For instance, I don't think that you'll see that in the Democratic Party. Maybe a Republican, maybe Trump is. I can't tell what's going to happen to the Republican Party. I think if Trump gets soundly defeated, the business Republicans, the Karl Roves, the Chamber of Commerce, none of whom support him, the Kochs, will resume command of the party. And they'll go for a politics that, again, stresses deregulation and tax cuts, but not privatization of Social Security and stuff like that got them in some kind of trouble. But and that they'll do very well in 2018. If Trump does very well, it might encourage imitators. I don't think he's going to stick around as a major political figure. I've been reading about Berlusconi a little, and what's striking is how brilliant a politician, he organized a party, it's completely different from Trump, and they're similar in mentality and billionaires and celebrity, but he really put it all together, where Trump is running this, entirely by himself campaign. Weird campaign. It's again, it has nothing to do with Mussolini. He's not having his little armies and stuff like that.
Yes.
So I'm a comparative political scientist, or aspiring to be one in the department, and our kind of favorite pet question to ask people is, how does the story or the theory that you've told travel to my favorite case? This preface is basically
Travel where?
Travel to my favorite set of countries or set of cases that I look at, which is basically to say, if you don't really want to answer this, feel free to not to. But how well do you think what you said would either help us think about the rise of populists in Latin America, so people like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or Rafael Correa in Ecuador. How do you think that this theory helps explain the fact that places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, other industrialized economies haven't seemed to have developed this populist wave in the same way as the United States and Western Europe? Or just more generally, how well do you think what you're saying is generally applicable, or is this something that's very much grounded in the histories and experiences of the United States and Western Europe?
That's a really hard question, and somebody asked me that too, and I don't have a good. I mean, part of it, I'm not going to talk about Latin America because I really don't know a lot. But the Canada-Australia thing is interesting because they're both settler colonial nations like ours. Canada more homogeneous, I think, than the United States, without the same kind of underclass. Also, didn't get hit nearly as hard by the Great Recession as we did. Also with a much more developed welfare state. So again, I think those are factors that keep politics between the left center and the center right and don't veer off into populism. Australia again is, I mean, the Aborigines are not like, it's not the same thing as African Americans here. You know, there was a big immigrant problem from New Guinea, with people coming down from New Guinea. And Tony Abbott had a certain elements of populism about him, but he's out. So again, I don't pretend to be able to answer. I think the thing about Canada, I gave you something of a real answer.
Yes, Reggie.
I wonder if you see any populist strains in Hillary's campaign, and along with that, I wonder if Hillary might make use of some of these populist strains to stop Trump.
I think Bill Clinton from Arkansas ran in 1992 a campaign with lots of populist strains. Putting people before profits was the name of his campaign thing. But it also had another dimension that people didn't see unless they lived in certain places, which was that in a lot of the swing state areas, the first thing they did was promise welfare reform. So it had different, in other words, it wasn't all people before profits. There was a very carefully calibrated campaign. Hillary Clinton, in my view, is not a thematic politician. I divide politicians generally into thematic versus bullet point politicians. For some politicians, politics consists of a set of programs and things like that they're going to implement. For others, it's thematic. It's where they want the country to move. Trump is a thematic politician. Bill Clinton is a thematic. George W. Bush was a thematic politician. Margaret Thatcher was a thematic politician. Michael Dukakis, bullet point. George H.W. Bush, bullet point politician. So anyway, I think she has a lot of trouble. Populism basically demands a kind of thematic approach to politics that's not focused on, what program I'm going to propose that will get through the Congressional Budget Office. But that's very much her outlook. So I think she has trouble in that terrain. And it was a real problem in the primaries against Bernie because people couldn't figure out what the hell she really was for, except that she wasn't for what he was for. In the general election, she's mainly just running against Trump's character and ability to be president. I think that's the focus and the threat that he poses to various identity groups within the population, Hispanics, African Americans in particular. So,
is she throwing away the election by not doing more to emphasize the positive vision that she could project if she were more populist?
I don't think she's going to throw it away. I think she's going to win. I think Trump, I thought that in May, when Trump sewed up the nomination, he would move to the center and stop a lot of the crazy stuff, with the Mexican judge and all that thing. But he hasn't, and he's just run the whole campaign by his bootstraps, and And even that debate, that first debate, I thought, well, that's not going to be that damaging because, you know, the same kind of factor. He's not PC and all this stuff. But then he went on for a whole week with the Miss Universe stuff. So he's run a very damaging campaign to himself. I mean, he's inspired some people, but he's really stepped right into what she wanted to do in terms of their strategy for discrediting him. And, you know, something miraculous might happen on Sunday night, but I doubt it. I think she's going to win.
The best thing she did was get 2 psychiatrists, because that was my business. And I could see how they had clued her, how you could break him down. At the end of that thing, I think he was totally out of it.
I never heard that.
Debate number 1.
Yes.
I'm from Spain. Then I have heard that you think that Brexit could be the beginning of the end of the European Union. I would like to know your reasons, apart from the populism,
I'm going to have to go.
for the break of the European Union.
Will they quit it too?
You understand?
Pardon, quit it too. Will they quit it too?
On Brexit.
Brexit. Yeah, Brexit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
You have said.
Yes, again, I was,
On the European Union.
yes, I get it.
Of the European Union.
Yes.
And then is the populism, because I think that Great Britain has not been ever as much as confident with the European Union. And then other countries are more confident with the European Union. You understand my question?
Yes.
Which are the reasons you think, like other North American, about the end of the European Union?
Fine. I get it. What I would say again is that that Europe, Western Europe, is in a much more difficult position than the United States. This is comparative. In Spain, as far as I could tell, there's still a tremendous amount of support for staying within Europe. Being part of Europe was seen as an alternative after Franco. I mean, it was, what's the Ortega's statement about Spain? I can't remember the exact term about it, but it's very important for Spain to be part of Europe. So Podemos had to always treaded very carefully on that issue. Their economists would tell you privately that the only solution for their problems was to leave the euro. But publicly, they, especially after the Syriza gave in to the European Union, to the Troika, they did not say that publicly anymore. But again, you can see structural problems there that could lead one of those countries eventually to saying, we just can't make it under these terms. We can't be prosperous. There would have to be, I mean, the proposals you see, for instance, on the left are either making the European Union, the central part of the European Union, more powerful economically, giving it a major fiscal role, or leaving the European Union. Now, either seem impossible right now, both. But again, I'm saying that Brexit, Britain leaving, might foreshadow that path, the path of leaving, rather than the path of staying and suffering. It's just hard. It's hard to say. If there's another big downturn, I think there'll be big support in Italy, Greece, and Spain for getting out, and maybe more in Italy and Greece than in Spain. And one of those countries leaves, it's going to be very difficult. But I don't know. Again, I'm making a comparative point with the United States.
We have to stop. And thank you, John. This has been a model of candor and intelligence.
Great. Thank you.